Interesting, actually, that the effect of David Ogilvy's writings were slightly complicated because depending on who read them, they either obeyed them slavishly to the letter or, of course, refused to accept that a single sentence in the book could be true and went completely in the opposite direction, depending on the degree of perversity of the person reading the book. And there's been a sort of uneasy relationship between the creative world and rules or science or academia ever since, which, as part of the IPA job, I'm actually trying to resolve a little bit. And David himself realized that actually, people had misunderstood him to some extent. He used the phrase, not rules, but tools, you fools, was his phrase. There was extraordinary denial over there that the cuckoo clock was German. And I know you've been trying to blame this thing on the Swiss for about the past 100 years. In fact, not true. The cuckoo clock was, in fact, invented in Germany. You're very, very quick to deny that, I can see, and to try and foist the blame on someone else. But it is, I suppose, evidence that not every time when you ask the question, what if, do you actually come up with a good answer. the question, what if, has to be actually attached to some sort of discernment or judgment, because what if we make a really hideous clock and stick a bird in it? Probably, of all the what if questions you could ask, isn't perhaps the best one. However, to make up for blaming the nation of Germany for the cuckoo clock, I want to say that it is here in Berlin, 200 years ago this year, that was asked what I consider to be one of the greatest what-ifs of all time. It's one of the great, most perfect examples of a creative question being asked and answered. And it happened when the war against Napoleon was reaching its height in, as you can guess, 1810. And the Prussian economy was desperately short of funds and needed to raise funds from the population. And they did what I consider the most brilliant thing in terms of marketing and the imagination I've come across virtually anywhere. They got the wealthy to donate their gold jewellery to the cause. It was rather like a sort of financial crisis, and they got people to actually hand in their gold to actually support the war effort against Napoleon. But every gold piece you gave, every gold piece of jewellery you gave, was replaced with a cast iron replica. And for about the next 100 years, the highest status jewellery you could wear in Prussia was not gold jewellery, it was jewellery made out of iron. Because it proved not only had your family been rich, but they were also the good kind of rich, which is rich and generous. And so it was a brilliant, brilliant exercise in rebranding. Because what it actually did is something that all marketers should aspire to do. It took physical value and replaced it with intangible value. It took jewellery that had a physical innate value in the shape that it was made of gold, and instead, it took the gold and replaced it with something more valuable, but where the value consisted of symbolic value, not of material value. So I think, if you think about it, it's one of the most extraordinary and ingenious marketing campaigns, to actually take something where the value resides in the physical, in the resources and the labour and so forth put into its creation, and to replace it with actually something where the value lies in its meaning. And if you look out of the window, don't all do it now, please, because it'll completely disrupt the speech. You'll see another example of this. There's a little car down there, a little smart car, which is part of a car club. And you can rent it for as little as €1 an hour. And then you park it on the street. We have them in London as well, and they're shared. And actually, the question that the environmental movement needs to ask today, and the question maybe all of you need to be asking, is can we do the same thing that the Prussians did in 1810 for cars? In other words, can we make it a higher status thing to rent a small car than to own a big one? What's interesting about this is more and more as you look at the world, you realise that actually the problems faced by mankind, and indeed the opportunities faced by mankind, aren't actually problems anymore of material supply. They're not basic problems of getting food to the right place. They're very largely, in the developed world at least, problems of perception. How do you get people to look at things differently? The problem is that nearly everybody who holds the levers of power has no interest or experience in what you might call perceptual thinking. They don't really come from a what-if background. They come from a background of how. Overwhelmingly, if you look at the composition of boards of directors, they're composed of a large number of engineers with a large number of finance specialists who adopt a highly mechanistic and sort of hyper-rational approach to problem solving. It's very, very good, and those people are very, very important for solving what you might call logistical problems. And I emphatically do not disparage logistical talent. I mean, as creative people all remember this as well. I came here today by British Airways. I don't want to think that the people who check the wheel nuts on British Airways aircraft are desperately creative people, okay? You know, I don't want them going, hey, let's just try anti-clockwise this time, just to see what happens, okay? You know, I don't want the people who check the engines to be wildly imaginative. I mean, the need for methodology, consistency, process, and so forth isn't diminishing. What I'm saying is that the need for the kind of talents you bring is actually increasing. And that increasingly, understanding of, you know, the extraordinary arbitrary nature of human perception, that actually, you know, depending on the context, iron jewellery can be worth more than gold jewellery. Understanding also the extraordinarily sort of arbitrary and interesting nature of human behaviour and how you change it is actually the real science of the age that I think should be the great growth area for academic research and for business activity in the next 20 or 30 years. I'll give you three very quick stories just to illustrate this. One of them is a very simple thing you can all Google on the web this evening, and it's simply called the $300 million button. Has anybody read it? It comes from a piece of web design where a very large American e-tailer was effectively brought in a couple of experts just to look at their usability of their website. And these people looked at the website and they said, most of what you have here is very, very good. But we suspect that there's one page that's very, very bad. And they went in and they changed a single word on a single button. The word was originally register. What happened is you checked out. When you'd filled your basket at this website, you checked out, and as soon as you checked out, you were given a choice, which was sign in or register. And they changed the word register to continue and said, you know, if you haven't shopped with us before, just click continue. If you want to, you can register later. Tiny change. All it did was it took a little bit of an upfront commitment and actually deferred it, if you like. There was something about the suggestion that you should register before you'd even bought from these people that was a bit presumptuous. It was a bit like taking someone out on a first date and they started talking about marriage. You know, it's faintly alarming. And so they changed that. As a result of that single change, costing perhaps $200 to a single page on one e-tail website, the sales the following year, attributable to that change, went up by $300 million. Now, that is just one example of how one of the things someone said, I think, what was it, dare to be naive. Mm-hmm. The other thing in this business, dare to be trivial. Quite a lot of human behaviour is actually predicated on very, very small signals. And one of the problems you have in organisations is that the very people with the power to change things think it's beneath their dignity to look at anything small. You know, if you think about it, the board of directors of that e-tailer will spend all their time talking about the large cost items on the budget and their latest, you know, procurement efforts and things that cost hundreds of millions. They won't be sitting there talking about the functionality of the checkout process. And yet that's probably where the greatest return actually lies. I'll give you two more stories, exactly illustrating the same thing. A non-German car company in Germany was about to sell off their last of their stock. And they were about to give a €3,000 discount on the, I think probably the old Ford Mondeo, something like that. And they were just about to do an advertising campaign that said, save €3,000 on a Ford Mondeo, when a fairly junior guy who'd done a course in behavioural economics asked the question, he said, are you sure that's the best we could do? And they said, well, €4,000 would be better, but we haven't got €4,000, so yes, €3,000. He said, no, I don't mean that. He said, would it be more powerful if instead of saying €3,000 off the purchase price of a new Mondeo, we actually gave €3,000 on the trade-in price of your old car? And they said, well, that's exactly the same, isn't it? I said, what's the difference? They said, well, it's exactly the same. He said, it's exactly the same if you're an accountant, said, or an economist, but not if you're a human being. So they tested it, and they tried it, and they made it €3,000 on, a bonus on the trade-in price for your old car, rather than €3,000 off. The difference was so pronounced that when they rolled the as you can guess, the second one out, nationally, it accounted for the sale of an extra 20,000 cars. And bear in mind, this isn't a major brand in Germany, so that's a spectacular effect. And the third example of dare to be trivial comes from, I suppose, the University of Chicago, an extraordinary man called Richard Thaler, who's the co-author of a very good book called Nudge. Has anybody read it? Thaler and Sunstein. He invented a pension called the Save More Tomorrow pension. And the question was, how do we get young people to take out pensions? And he looked at some innate human biases in behaviour. One of them is a thing called loss aversion. We hate to see our disposable income go down. Another one, believe it or not, is called hyperbolic discounting, which is, by and large, we prefer to have costs in the slightly distant future rather than in the immediate present. We regard future costs. That's why, buy now, pay later is a motivating proposition. We prefer costs to be in the future rather than in the immediate sort of present. So he invented a pension plan, and you signed up, and you chose a percentage, let's say 25%. And you signed up for it, and nothing happened. And the next month, nothing happened. And the month after that, nothing happened. All that happened was when you got a pay rise, 25% of every pay rise you got in the future went into your pension plan. Two things happened. One, you never suffered an immediate loss. Secondly, you never saw your salary go down. All that happened is it went up slightly less excitingly. The result of that was that in the 5 years after they tested it, the amount invested in this kind of pension was about 60% higher than the amount invested in a conventional pension. Now, all of these examples come from a science called behavioral economics. And behavioral economics has, I think, a great deal to teach the advertising and marketing world and also the creative world. And what interests me, I think, is that I read that book, and my first reaction was, how on earth is it that it's a Chicago economics professor who came up with that idea, not one of the million people working in financial services marketing worldwide? And I thought, to some extent, there's a question the marketing world has to ask. So my belief is actually that what we can do is we can use behavioral economics to forge for some of the creative businesses something of a scientific framework on which you can attach your thinking. Now, what I don't want to do is for things to happen the Ogilvy way, where people either slavishly adhere to a school of thought or reject it completely. But I think it's a very important thing too. When I took over the IPA, the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising in the UK, it happens every time someone takes over as president every 2 years. About 15 people come to you and say, it's a really stupid name. Okay, you need to change the name. And I was warned this was going to happen, and actually I thought they were kind of right when I first heard it, because it is a ridiculous name. I mean, it was conceived in 1917, I think. But then I said, well, actually, there is an alternative, isn't there, which is that we actually keep the name and try and live up to it, and actually make the organisation match the name. And I said, well, actually, if you're going to be an institute, act like an institute. And the model I took is to say that in a very, very modest, miniature way, what I want to do is create an institute of advertising in the UK that plays the role in the advertising industry that Stanford University plays in the dot-com industry. There's a very good economist at Stanford called Paul Romer. And Paul Romer makes the point that you get real economic success and growth in a country or in a region where there's fantastic complementarity between what he calls institutions of science and institutions of the market. What you have at Stanford is big meta-research, often quite oblique research without an immediate payback, being done at Stanford, but beneath that there are huge, huge ranks of independent startups, venture capital firms and so forth, which live symbiotically with the university. And my view is what the ad industry needs is a kind of relationship like that. We're all businesses that are too small as agencies to do our own R&D. But I genuinely believe it's through institutions like this one, and actually by creating institutions of science around the creative subjects that actually live symbiotically with the institutions of the market, that we can make the creative industries much bigger, much more successful, and finally much more influential than they have been to date. And there's a very important reason for this. I mentioned earlier, the levers of power within organizations do not sit with creative people at the moment. They sit with people who are specialists in procurement, in finance, in financial re-engineering, in engineering itself. There's a woeful problem in business to the extent to which organisations have virtually no capacity for human understanding within their senior people. The actual discipline, a vital discipline of saying, would it be better to make it 3,000 euros on rather than 3,000 euros off, the people who ask those questions don't actually have the power to do anything about them. And that's the fundamental problem you have, that the people at the very top regard it as beneath their dignity to deal with these little psychological problems at the bottom, even if in truth it's there that the real difference is made. It's in those creative and human insight-driven areas that the real difference is made. Now, the vital thing I think we can do with your organisation, with institutions like the IPA, is, first of all, we can actually centralise R&D. You know, we can actually say, let's do R&D for an industry and not just for an agency. One of the problems agencies have always done, I think, is that whenever they come up with a new methodology, they always try and make it unique to the agency. Now, I thought that was a very, very good thing, because we're obsessed with the USP in advertising, of course, until I realised that actually, to clients, the fact that you're the only agency that uses this methodology doesn't mean it's unique and special. It means it's probably rubbish. There's a sort of confidence in numbers approach to any kind of methodology. But the second thing I think we failed in is by not attaching the creative world to some sort of recognisable psychological science, we've lost influence. And that's the thing that worries me most. If you think about it, the language of marketing, described to me by a colleague, as it's a bit like the language of astrology. If you're a fellow believer, it sounds incredibly convincing. But if you're not, it makes you sound like an idiot. It's one of those things. My brother's actually a professional astronomer, and his nightmare is going to a party, being introduced to someone, it happens all the time, which is, what do you do? I'm an astronomer. That's very interesting. I'm a Sagittarius. Trust me. It's about the worst thing that ever happens. Oh. But if you think about it, we've committed the same crime. You know, we're talking to a bunch of people who are the board of directors who have to go to Deutsche Bank tomorrow and explain to their analysts why their EBITDA is 3% down on projection. Now, what they're not going to say to those guys is, have you seen my mood board? Okay? What we have to do is we need to actually declare a truce between the creative industries and the scientific industries. I mean absolutely a truce. I do not mean a surrender. The really important thing to remember about science, about scientific investigation, about academic investigation into the arts of persuasion and human decision-making, is that none of these things is a substitute for an idea. However, and this is the vital however, a really good scientific understanding of these things will A, help you generate better ideas, and B, make you better at judging them. So what you'll come up with, I hope, is more cast iron jewellery and a few less cuckoo clocks. So that's my vital thing. There's been this completely false dichotomy between the idea, the idea is that I'm a creative person, therefore I need to know nothing about, this. I simply do it as an expression of my own extraordinary interior talent, equally. Or there's the kind of approach in finance, which is I will just slavishly adhere to these particular things. The trick is actually to get the balance right between, the science and the imagination, and actually use it as a framework on which to have ideas and a framework by which to build them, but never as a substitute. The real secret of the next 20 years lies in understanding how value is created, and in getting the organisations we deal with to understand that value is subjective. I mentioned this Prussian experience of 1810. The other great person is a great guy, Ludwig von Mises, an Austrian economist, who was so dedicated to the idea that value is subjective that he refused to use mathematics in economics. His claim was that since human preference is ordinal rather than cardinal, that actually to use numbers at all is a misrepresentation of how humans think and decide. As a result, they're slightly ostracized by other economists. But nonetheless, there's an interesting point here, which is that his point is that actually there's no such thing as a real value, the labour theory of value, the raw material theory of value. The only form of value there is simply subjective. And therefore, what we do by creating value, by changing the way people look at things, appraise them, and judge them, is every bit as valuable and as valid as a form of value creation as digging things out of the ground or making things in a factory. The vital thing is we actually get other parts of business to actually recognise that. And that's the trick, and that's the really big task for the next 20 years. Thanks very much indeed.